Prepare for the one event that absolutely shattered the ancient world. This video reveals the battle that changed history, Arrian's account of Alexander the Great's decisive victory at Gaugamela. Imagine a battlefield so vast, forces so immense, that it felt like the fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. How did Alexander, facing the largest army of his career led by Darius III himself, engineer a victory that was not just a triumph, but a complete strategic masterpiece? What brilliant, audacious maneuver turned the tide against overwhelming odds? In this deep dive into Arrian's Anabasis, Book 3, we'll meticulously break down every crucial moment of Gaugamela, showing you exactly how Alexander cemented his place as history's greatest general. This isn't just a retelling, it's an immersive look at a tactical marvel. Hit that like button if you think Gaugamela was Alexander's finest hour, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more epic historical analyses. The Anabasis of Alexander, Book 3. Chapter 1. Egypt and the Foundation of Alexandria. Alexander now led an expedition into Egypt, his initial destination from Tyre. Marching from Gaza, he arrived at Pelusium in Egypt on the 7th day. His fleet had also sailed from Phoenicia and was already moored at Pelusium. Mazax, the Persian viceroy of Egypt, learned of the Battle of Bessus, that Darius had fled in disgrace and that Phoenicia, Syria, and most of Arabia were under Alexander's control. Having no Persian forces to resist, Mazax friendly admitted Alexander into the cities and country. Alexander placed a garrison in Pelusium and ordered his ships to sail up the river to Memphis. He himself journeyed towards Heliopolis, keeping the Nile on his right. He reached Heliopolis through the desert, having secured all places on the march through voluntary surrender. From there, he crossed the stream to Memphis. He offered sacrifices to Apis and other gods and held a gymnastic and musical contest, drawing distinguished artists from Greece. From Memphis, he sailed down the river towards the sea, embarking his shield-bearing guards, archers, Agrianians, and the royal squadron of companion cavalry. Reaching Conobus, he sailed around the Marian Lake and disembarked where the city of Alexandria now stands, named after him. He found the location ideal for a city and foresaw its prosperity. Seized by an ardent desire to undertake the enterprise, he personally marked out the city's boundaries. He designated sites for the agora, temples, specifying their number and the Greek gods they would honor, and particularly marked a spot for a temple to the Egyptian Isis. He also indicated where the wall would encircle it. He offered sacrifice regarding these matters, and the omens were favorable. The following story, which I find credible, is told. Alexander wished to leave behind clear boundary marks for the builders, but there was nothing at hand to make a furrow in the ground. One builder came up with the idea of collecting the soldiers' barley in vessels and scattering it on the ground where the king led. Thus, the city's fortification circle was clearly marked out. The soothsayers, especially Aristander the Telmician, known for many accurate predictions, pondered this. They told Alexander that the city would prosper in all respects, particularly in regard to agricultural produce. At this time, Hegelicus sailed to Egypt and informed Alexander that the Tenedians had revolted from the Persians and joined him, having initially allied with the Persians against their will. He also reported that the democracy of Chios was bringing in Alexander's supporters, despite those in control of the city, who had been established by Autophrodates and Pharnabazus. Pharnabazus himself had been captured there and held prisoner, as was the despot Aristonicus, a Methymnian. Aristonicus had sailed into Chios harbor with 5 pirate vessels, unaware that Alexander's supporters controlled it. He was misled by those guarding the harbor, believing Pharnabazus's fleet was still there. All the pirates were massacred by the Chians. Hegelicus brought Aristonicus, Apollonides the Chian, Physinus, Megareus, and all others involved in Chios's revolt to the Persians, who were then forcibly governing the island, as prisoners to Alexander. Hegelicus also announced that he had taken Mytilene from Chares, brought other cities in Lesbos over by voluntary agreement, and sent Amphoterus to Kos with 60 ships, as the Cones themselves had invited him. He stated that he had sailed to Kos and found it already in Amphoterus's hands. Hegelicus brought all prisoners with him except Pharnabazus, who had eluded his guards at Kos and escaped. Alexander sent the despots brought from the cities back to their fellow citizens to be dealt with as they pleased. But Apollonides and his Chian partisans were sent under strict guard to Elephantine, an Egyptian city. After these events, Alexander was seized by an ardent desire to visit Ammon in Libya. This was partly to consult the god, as the oracle of Ammon was renowned for its accurate information. Perseus and Heracles were said to have consulted it. Perseus when dispatched by Polydectes against the Gorgons, and Heracles when he visited Antiochus in Libya and Busiris in Egypt. Alexander was also partly driven by a desire to emulate Perseus and Heracles, from both of whom he traced his descent. He also derived his lineage from Ammon, just as legends traced Heracles and Perseus's lineage to Zeus. Accordingly, he undertook the expedition to Ammon to confirm his own origin, or at least to be able to claim he had learned it. According to Aristobulus, he advanced along the seashore to Perietonium through a desert country, though not without water, a distance of about 1,600 stades. From there, he turned inland to where the oracle of Ammon was located. The route is desert, mostly sand and lacking water. However, Alexander experienced copious rain, which was attributed to divine influence, as was another occurrence. When a south wind blows in that region, it heaps up sand far and wide over the route, obliterating road tracks. This makes it impossible to find one's way in the sand, just as at sea, as there are no landmarks, no mountains, trees, or permanent hills, by which travelers can infer the correct course, unlike sailors who use stars. Consequently, Alexander's army lost its way, and even the guides were uncertain. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, says 2 serpents went before the army, uttering a sound, and Alexander ordered the guides to follow them, trusting in the divine omen. He also states they showed the way to the oracle and back. But Aristobulus, whose account is generally accepted, says 2 ravens flew in front of the army and acted as Alexander's guides. I can confidently assert that some divine assistance was provided, as probability aligns with this supposition. However, discrepancies in the various narratives have deprived the story of certainty. The area where the Temple of Ammon is located is entirely surrounded by a vast, waterless desert of sand. The fertile spot within this desert is not extensive. At its widest, it is only about 40 stades broad. It is full of cultivated trees, olives, and palms, and is the only place in those parts refreshed with dew. A unique spring also rises there. At midday, the water is cold to the taste, and even colder to the touch, as cold as possible. But as the sun sets, it gradually warms. From evening until midnight, it continues to warm, reaching its hottest point at midnight. After midnight, it slowly cools, becoming cold by daybreak, and reaching its coldest point at midday. These alternating changes occur daily in regular succession. In this place, natural salt is also obtained by digging. Some of Ammon's priests transport quantities of it to Egypt. Whenever they journey to Egypt, they place it in small boxes woven from palm and carry it as a gift for the king or another great man. The salt grains are large, some longer than 3 fingers' breadth, and clear like crystal. Egyptians and others respectful of the deity use this salt in their sacrifices, as it is clearer than sea salt. Alexander was struck with wonder at the place and consulted the god's oracle. Having heard what was agreeable to his wishes, as he himself stated, he began his journey back to Egypt. According to Aristobulus, he returned by the same route. But according to Ptolemy, son of Lagus, he took another road, leading directly to Memphis. At Memphis, many Greek embassies reached him, and he sent no one away disappointed. An army of 400 Greek mercenaries also arrived from Antipater, commanded by Menidas, son of Hedgesander. Likewise, 500 cavalry arrived from Thrace, led by Asclepiodorus, son of Eunuchus. Here, Alexander offered sacrifice to Zeus the king, led his fully armed soldiers in a solemn procession, and celebrated a gymnastic and musical contest. He then settled the affairs of Egypt, appointing 2 Egyptians, Doloaspis and Petisus, as governors, dividing the entire land between them. However, as Petisus declined his province, Doloaspis received the whole. He appointed 2 companions as garrison commanders, Pantaleon the Pydnian in Memphis and Polemo, son of Megacles, a Pelion in Pelusium. He also gave command of the Greek auxiliaries to Lycidas, an Aetolian, and appointed Eugnostus, son of Xenophants, a companion, as secretary over the same troops. Aeschylus and Ephippus the Chalcidian were placed as their overseers. He granted the government of neighboring Libya to Apollonius, son of Carinus, and the part of Arabia near Hierapolis to Cleomenes, a man of Naucratis. Cleomenes was instructed to allow the governors to rule their districts according to ancient custom, but to collect the tribute due to Alexander from them. The native governors were also ordered to pay it to Cleomenes. He appointed Pusestes, son of Macertatus, and Balacrus, son of Amintas, as generals of the army he left behind in Egypt. He placed Polemo, son of Theramenes, as admiral over the fleet. Leonidas, son of Antaeus, became one of his bodyguards, replacing Aribas, who had died of disease. Antiochus, the commander of the archers, also died, and Ombrian the Cretan was appointed in his stead. When Balacrus was left behind in Egypt, the allied Greek infantry, which had been under his command, was put under Calenus. Alexander is said to have divided Egypt's government among so many men because he was struck by the country's natural strength and thought it unsafe to entrust its entire rule to a single person. The Romans, it seems to me, learned a lesson from him, and therefore keep Egypt under strong guard, not sending any senators there as proconsul for the same reason, but only men of equestrian rank. Chapter 2. Campaign into Syria and crossing the Tigris and Euphrates. As spring began, Alexander departed Memphis for Phoenicia, bridging the Nile and its canals. Upon reaching Tyre, he found his fleet waiting. In Tyre, he again honored Heracles with sacrifices and hosted both athletic and musical contests. While in Tyre, the Athenian state vessel, the Perilous, arrived, carrying envoys Diophantus and Achilles, along with its crew. They secured all their requests, and Alexander released the Athenians captured at the Granicus. Informed of revolutionary activities in the Peloponnese, Alexander dispatched Amphoterus to support those loyal to his war against Persia and independent of Lacedaemonian control. He also ordered the Phoenicians and Cyprians to send 100 additional ships to the Peloponnese, augmenting Amphoterus's fleet. Alexander then journeyed inland towards Thapsacus and the Euphrates River. He appointed Coeranus of Beroea to levy tribute in Phoenicia and Philoxenus to collect it in Asia, as far as the Taurus Mountains. He entrusted his treasury to Harpalus, son of Machadas, who had just returned from exile. Harpalus, along with Ptolemy, Nearchus, Erigius, and his brother Laomedon, had been banished during King Philip's reign for supporting Alexander. Alexander had fallen under Philip's suspicion after Philip married Eurydice and dishonored Olympias, Alexander's mother. After Philip's death, these exiles returned and were restored to favor. Alexander made Ptolemy one of his personal bodyguards. Harpalus, whose physical condition prevented him from military service, was placed in charge of the treasury. Erigius commanded the allied Greek cavalry, and his brother Laomedon, fluent in both Greek and Persian, managed foreign prisoners. Nearchus was appointed viceroy of Lycia and the adjacent lands up to Mount Taurus. However, shortly before the Battle of Issus, Harpalus, influenced by a man named Touriscus, fled with him. Touriscus eventually went to Alexander the Epirote in Italy, where he soon died. Harpalus sought refuge in Megaris, but Alexander persuaded him to return, promising no repercussions for his desertion. Upon his return, he received no punishment and was reinstated as treasurer. Menander, one of Alexander's companions, was sent to Lydia as viceroy, and Clearchus took command of the Greek auxiliaries previously under Menander. Asclepiodorus, son of Eunuchus, replaced Arimas as viceroy of Syria, as Arimas had been slow in collecting supplies for Alexander's upcoming inland campaign. Alexander reached Thapsacus in the month of Hecatombaean, during Aristophanes' archonship in Athens. He found 2 pontoon bridges already constructed across the Euphrates. Messias, whom Darius had tasked with guarding the river with approximately 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 of whom were Greek mercenaries, had been positioned there. This presence had prevented the Macedonians from completing the bridge to the opposite bank, fearing an assault. But upon hearing of Alexander's approach, Messias fled with his entire army. With his flight, the bridges were completed, and Alexander crossed with his forces. From there, he marched inland through Mesopotamia, with the Euphrates River and the Armenian mountains to his left. He chose an indirect route to Babylon, finding it easier for his army's march, providing better fodder for horses and provisions for men, and offering a less scorching climate. Captured Persian scouts reported that Darius was encamped near the Tigris River, intending to prevent Alexander from crossing. They also claimed Darius's army was significantly larger than the one he had commanded in Cilicia. Hearing this, Alexander hastened towards the Tigris. Upon arrival, he found neither Darius nor any guard. However, he faced great difficulty crossing the swift river, despite no opposition. After crossing, he allowed his army to rest. During this time, a nearly total lunar eclipse occurred. Alexander offered sacrifices to the moon, sun, and earth, the reported agents of such phenomena. The seer Aristander interpreted the eclipse as a favorable omen for Alexander and the Macedonians, predicting a battle that very month and signifying victory through the sacrificial offerings. Leaving the Tigris, Alexander marched through Etruria, with the Gordian Mountains to his left and the Tigris to his right. For days after crossing the river, his scouts reported enemy cavalry visible on the plain, though they could not determine their numbers. Alexander arrayed his army for battle. Other scouts, riding ahead for closer observation, then reported that the cavalry appeared to be no more than 1,000 strong. Chapter 3: Preparations and Strategy at Arbela, Gaugamela. Alexander, leading the royal cavalry squadron, 1 squadron of companions, and the Paeonian scouts, advanced rapidly, ordering the rest of his army to follow at a slower pace. The Persian cavalry, seeing Alexander's swift approach, began to flee. Though Alexander pursued them closely, most escaped. A few, whose horses were exhausted, were killed or captured, along with their horses. From these captives, Alexander learned that Darius, with a large force, was nearby. Darius had been reinforced by Indians bordering Bactria, the Bactrians themselves, and the Sogdianians, all commanded by Bessus, the viceroy of Bactria. Sacians, an Asian Scythian tribe allied with Darius and led by Mavises, also joined, serving as horsebowmen. Barsanes, viceroy of Arachosia, led the Arachosians and mountain Indians. Satabarzanes, viceroy of Aria, led the Arrians. Phrataphernes commanded the Parthians, Hyrcanians, and Tepurians, all cavalry. Atropates led the Medes, joined by Cadusians, Albanians, and Sassacinians. Ocondabates, Ariobarzanes, and Otanes marshaled men from near the Red Sea. Oxythres, son of Abelites, led the Uxians and Susianians, and Bapars commanded the Babylonians. Carians, who had been deported to Central Asia, and Sidicinians were also with the Babylonians. Orontes and Mithrastes led the Armenians, and Ariases commanded the Cappadocians. Messias led the Syrians from Coele, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Darius's entire army reportedly included 40,000 cavalry, 1 million infantry, and 200 scythe chariots. There were also about 15 elephants from the Indians west of the Industry. With these forces, Darius encamped at Gaugamela, near the Beaumetus River, about 600 stades from Arbela. The area was entirely flat. Any uneven ground unsuitable for cavalry maneuvers had long since been leveled by the Persians to facilitate chariots and horses. Some had convinced Darius that the narrow battlefield at Issus had caused his previous defeat, a belief he readily accepted. After receiving this intelligence from the captured Persian scouts, Alexander rested his army for 4 days. He fortified his camp with a ditch and stockade, intending to leave behind baggage and non-combatant soldiers, taking only his fully armed warriors into battle. He then began his march during the second watch of the night, aiming to confront the enemy at daybreak. Upon learning of Alexander's approach, Darius immediately drew his army into battle formation. Alexander likewise arranged his men. Although the armies were only 60 stades apart, intervening hills concealed them from each other. When Alexander was 30 stades from the enemy, and his army descended from the hills, he sighted the Persians and halted his phalanx. He called a council of his companions, generals, cavalry officers, and leaders of the Greek allies and mercenaries. He debated whether to advance immediately, as most urged, or to encamp and thoroughly scout the terrain, as Parmenio suggested. Parmenio argued for examining the ground for hidden dangers like ditches or stakes, and for a more accurate assessment of the enemy's formation. Parmenio's counsel prevailed. They encamped, maintaining their battle formation. Alexander then took light infantry and cavalry companions to reconnoiter the entire battlefield. Upon his return, he again gathered his leaders. He stated that they needed no encouragement from him, as their valor and past achievements were sufficient. He emphasized that each leader, from infantry captains to brigade commanders, should individually inspire his men. Alexander declared that this battle was not, like previous ones, for Syria, Phoenicia, or Egypt, but for all of Asia. This battle, he said, would decide who would rule the continent. He stressed that their natural valor made extensive speeches unnecessary. Instead, they must focus on maintaining discipline in action, observing perfect silence when advancing stealthily, and shouting with full force when advantageous, raising a terrible battle cry at the opportune moment. He urged swift obedience to his orders, rapid transmission through the ranks, and reminded them that individual diligence contributed to victory, while negligence increased overall risk. After this brief exhortation, his officers reciprocated with assurances of their valor. Alexander then ordered the soldiers to dine and rest. Parmenio reportedly approached Alexander in his tent, suggesting a night attack on the Persians, believing they would be unprepared, confused, and prone to panic in the dark. Alexander, however, responded, within earshot of others, that it would be dishonorable to steal a victory. He must conquer in broad daylight, without artifice. This declaration was seen not as arrogance, but as self-confidence in danger. In my view, Alexander's reasoning was sound. Night battles are fraught with unforeseen incidents, often causing prepared forces to fail and giving victory to the weaker side against all expectations. Alexander, though generally keen to engage in battle, considered the night perilous. Moreover, if Darius were defeated again, a stealthy night attack would spare him the admission that he was an inferior general commanding inferior troops. Additionally, if Alexander's army suffered an unexpected defeat, the surrounding territory was enemy-friendly, and the Macedonians were unfamiliar with it, surrounded by foes and numerous prisoners who might turn on them in the night, even without a decisive Macedonian defeat. For these reasons, I commend Alexander's judgment and his desire to fight openly. Darius and his army remained in their initial battle formation throughout the night. They had not fully entrenched their camp and feared a night attack. This prolonged readiness and the fear preceding great dangers, rather than a sudden panic, severely hampered the Persians' effectiveness and thoroughly disheartened them. Darius's army was deployed as follows, according to Aristobulus's account of Darius's captured battle plan. The left wing comprised Bactrian cavalry, with Dons and Aracocians, followed by mixed Persian horse and foot, then Susians, and finally Cadusians. This arrangement extended to the center of the phalanx. The right wing included men from Syria and Mesopotamia, then Medes, followed by Parthians and Sacians, then Tepurians and Hyrcanians, and lastly Albanians and Sassanians, also extending to the center. In the center, with King Darius, were the king's kinsmen, Persian guards with golden apple-tipped spears, Indians, Carians forcibly moved to Central Asia, and Mardian archers. The Uxians, Babylonians, men from near the Red Sea, and Sidicinians were drawn up in deep columns. Opposite Alexander's right wing, on Darius's left, were about 1,000 Scythian and Bactrian cavalry and 100 scythe chariots. In front of Darius's royal cavalry squadron stood the elephants and 50 chariots. In front of the right wing were Armenian and Cappadocian cavalry with 50 scythe chariots. The Greek mercenaries, considered capable of confronting the Macedonians, were positioned directly opposite their phalanx, in 2 divisions flanking Darius and his Persian attendants. Alexander's army was marshaled thus. The right wing was held by the cavalry companions, with the royal squadron, commanded by Clytus, son of Dropidas, at the front. Near this was Glaucias's squadron, then Aristos, then Sopoles, son of Hermodorus, and then Heraclides, son of Antiochus. Next was Demetrius, son of Althaemenes, then Meleagrus, and finally one of the royal squadrons led by Hegelicus, son of Hippostratus. All cavalry companions were under the supreme command of Philotas, son of Parmenio. Of the Macedonian infantry phalanx, nearest the cavalry were the select corps of shield-bearing guards, followed by the rest of the shield-bearing guards, all under Nicanor, son of Parmenio. Next was Caenis, son of Polemocrates' brigade, then Perdicaeus, son of Orontes', then Meleager, son of Neoptolemus's, then Polysperchon, son of Simmias's, and finally Amyntas, son of Andromenes's, commanded by Simmias due to Amyntas's mission to Macedonia to raise an army. Craterus, son of Alexander's brigade, held the left end of the Macedonian phalanx, and he commanded the left wing of the infantry. Next to him was the allied Greek cavalry, commanded by Erigius, son of Larichus. Further left were the Thessalian cavalry, under Philip, son of Menelaus. The entire left wing was led by Parmenio, son of Philotas, with the elite and numerous Pharsalian horsemen of the Thessalian cavalry positioned around him. Alexander thus arrayed his army in a primary formation and a secondary, deeper one. Reserve commanders were instructed to wheel around and counterattack if their comrades were surrounded by the Persian army. Next to the royal squadron on the right wing, half of the Agrianians, led by Attalus, along with Macedonian archers under Briso, were posted at an angle. This was to allow the phalanx to fold back or deepen if necessary, flanking the enemy. Next to the archers were veteran mercenaries commanded by Cleander. In front of the Agrianians and archers were skirmishing light cavalry and Paeonians, led by Arates and Aristo. At the very front were Greek mercenary cavalry under Menidas. In front of the royal cavalry squadron and other companions were the other half of the Agrianians and archers, and Balacrus's javelin men, positioned opposite the scythe chariots. Menidas and his troops were ordered to wheel and attack the enemy's flank if they attempted to ride around Alexander's wing. This completed Alexander's right-wing arrangements. On the left, Thracians under Cytalus were positioned at an angle, with cavalry of Greek allies under Coeranus nearby. Next stood the Odrysian cavalry, commanded by Agatho, son of Turimus. In this section, at the front, were auxiliary cavalry of Greek mercenaries, led by Andromachus, son of Hiero. Thracian infantry guarded the baggage. Alexander's entire army consisted of 7,000 cavalry and approximately 40,000 infantry. Chapter 4: Battle of Arbela and Pursuit of Darius. As the armies closed in, Darius was seen surrounded by his apple-bearing Persians, Indians, Albanians, Carians, and Mardian archers, all directly opposite Alexander and his royal cavalry. Alexander led his army further to the right, with the Persians mirroring his movement, significantly outflanking him on their left. Scythian cavalry rode along the Persian line, clashing with Alexander's vanguard. Alexander, however, continued his rightward march, nearly moving beyond the Persians' pre-cleared leveled ground. Fearing his chariots would be useless on uneven terrain, Darius ordered the front ranks of his left wing to ride around Alexander's right, where Alexander commanded, to prevent further movement. In response, Alexander ordered the Greek mercenary cavalry, led by Menidas, to attack. But the more numerous Scythian and Bactrian cavalry charged, routing the smaller Greek force. Alexander then sent Aristo with the Paeonians and Greek auxiliaries against the Scythians, forcing them to retreat. However, the rest of the Bactrians then engaged the Paeonians and Greek auxiliaries, rallying their fleeing comrades and igniting a general cavalry battle. Many of Alexander's men fell, overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the superior body armor of the Scythian cavalry and their horses. Yet, the Macedonians withstood the assault, pushing them back squadron by squadron. Meanwhile, the Persians launched their scythe chariots at Alexander's phalanx, hoping to cause disarray. This proved a grave miscalculation. As some chariots approached, the Agrianians and javelin men with balacris, positioned in front of the companion cavalry, hurled their javelins. Others seized the reins, pulled off drivers, and killed the horses. Some chariots broke through the lines as the Macedonian soldiers, as instructed, opened their ranks to let them pass. Most chariots passed through safely, their drivers unharmed, but these were later overcome by Alexander's army grooms and the royal shield-bearing guards. As Darius began to advance his entire phalanx, Alexander ordered Ariates to attack those attempting to encircle his right wing. Alexander himself was leading his men in column. When the Persians created a gap in their front line, as cavalry sallied forth to support the encircling force, Alexander wheeled towards this opening. Forming a wedge of companion cavalry and the adjacent phalanx, he charged directly at Darius with a quick, loud battle cry. A brief hand-to-hand struggle ensued. But as the Macedonian cavalry, led by Alexander, pressed vigorously, thrusting spears into the Persians' faces, and the dense Macedonian phalanx, bristling with pikes, also attacked, Darius, already fearful, was overcome with terror and was the first to turn and flee. The Persians attempting to encircle the wing were also alarmed by Ariates' vigorous attack. Here, the Persians rapidly fled, and the Macedonians pursued and slaughtered them. Simmias and his brigade could not immediately join Alexander's pursuit. Halting his phalanx, he engaged in the fight because Alexander's left wing was reported to be hard-pressed. In this sector, the Macedonian line was broken, allowing some Indians and Persian cavalry to burst through to the Macedonian baggage. The fighting there became desperate, as the Persians boldly attacked mostly unarmed men, who never expected their double phalanx to be breached. The foreign prisoners also joined the attack on the Macedonians amidst the chaos. However, commanders of the reserve phalanx, learning what transpired, quickly moved to the rear of the Persians, killing many gathered around the baggage. The remaining Persians then fled. Meanwhile, the Persians on the right wing, unaware of Darius's flight, rode around Alexander's left wing and attacked Parmenio's flank. At this critical moment, with the Macedonians uncertain of the battle's outcome, Parmenio urgently dispatched a messenger to Alexander, reporting their dire situation and requesting aid. Upon receiving this news, Alexander immediately turned back from his pursuit. Wheeling the companion cavalry, he swiftly led them against the enemy's right wing. He first attacked the fleeing enemy cavalry, Parthians, some Indians, and the largest and bravest division of Persians. This led to the most fiercely contested cavalry engagement of the entire battle. The enemy cavalry, organized in squadrons, wheeled and engaged Alexander's men face to face. They no longer relied on javelins or skillful maneuvers, as was common in cavalry battles, but each man desperately fought to break through, as if his own survival depended on it. They struck and were struck without quarter, fighting not for victory for another, but for their own lives. Here, about 60 of Alexander's companions fell, and Hephaestion, Cenis, and Menidas were wounded. Yet, Alexander's troops overcame them. Those who could force their way through his ranks fled with all their might. Alexander was about to engage the enemy's right wing directly, but the Thessalian cavalry, in a magnificent struggle, had already achieved success comparable to his own. The enemy on the right wing was already beginning to flee when Alexander arrived. Thus, he wheeled around again and resumed his pursuit of Darius, continuing as long as daylight allowed. Parmenio's brigade also pursued their opponents. Alexander crossed the Lycus River and camped there to rest his men and horses. Parmenio seized the Persian camp, along with their baggage, elephants, and camels. After resting his horsemen until midnight, Alexander pressed on with a forced march towards Arbela, hoping to capture Darius, his money, and his royal possessions. He reached Arbela the next day, having pursued for about 600 stades from the battlefield. Darius, however, continued his relentless flight and was not found at Arbela. Nevertheless, the money and all other property were captured, as were Darius's chariot, spear, and bow, mirroring the aftermath of the Battle of Bessus. About 100 of Alexander's men were killed, and over 1,000 of his horses were lost either from wounds or exhaustion during the pursuit, nearly half of them belonging to the companion cavalry. Of the enemy, an estimated 300,000 were slain, and far more were taken prisoner. The elephants and all chariots not destroyed in battle were also captured. This was the outcome of the battle, fought during the archonship of Aristophanes in Athens, in the month of Pyeneption. Aristander's prediction that Alexander would fight and win a battle in the same month as the lunar eclipse was thus fulfilled. Immediately after the battle, Darius fled through the Armenian mountains towards Media. He was accompanied by the Bactrian cavalry, who had fought with him, some of the king's kinsmen Persians, and a few apple-bearers. About 2,000 of his Greek mercenaries also joined his flight, led by Paran the Phocian and Glaucus the Aetolian. He fled towards Media because he believed Alexander would head directly to Susa and Babylon after the battle, as that region was populated and the route was easy for baggage trains. Additionally, Babylon and Susa were the primary war prizes. The road to Media, however, was not easy for a large army. In this conjecture, Darius was mistaken. Alexander left Arbela and marched directly towards Babylon. Nearing the city, he arrayed his army for battle and advanced. The Babylonians, with their priests and rulers, came out en masse to meet him, individually bringing gifts and offering to surrender their city, citadel, and treasury. Upon entering Babylon, Alexander ordered the rebuilding of all temples Xerxes had destroyed, especially that of Belus, whom the Babylonians revered most. He appointed Mazias as viceroy of Babylon, Apollodorus the Amphipolitan as general of the soldiers remaining with Mazias, and Asclepiodorus, son of Philo, as revenue collector. He also sent Mithranes, who had surrendered the citadel of Sardis, to Armenia as viceroy. In Babylon, he met with the Chaldeans, performed whatever religious rites they directed, and specifically offered sacrifice to Belus according to their instructions. He then marched to Susa. En route, he was met by the son of the Susian viceroy, and a man carrying a letter from Philoxenus, whom Alexander had dispatched to Susa immediately after the battle. Philoxenus reported that the Susians had surrendered their city, and that all money was secure for Alexander. 20 days after leaving Babylon, Alexander reached Susa. Entering the city, he took possession of 50,000 talents of money and other royal property. Many items Xerxes had brought from Greece were also captured, particularly the bronze statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. Alexander sent these back to the Athenians. They now stand in the Ceramicus in Athens, near the ascent to the Acropolis, opposite the temple of Rhea, mother of the gods, not far from the altar of the Eudaimonie. Those initiated into the mysteries of the two goddesses at Eleusis know the altar of Eudaimonis on the plain. At Susa, Alexander performed sacrifices according to his ancestral customs and held a torch race and gymnastic contest. He then left Abulites, a Persian, as viceroy of Susiana, Mazaris, a companion, as commander of the Susa citadel garrison, and Archelaus, son of Theodorus, as general. He then advanced into Persian territory. He also sent Menes to the coast as governor of Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia, giving him 3,000 talents of silver to convey to the sea, with orders to send as much of it to Antipater as he needed for the war against the Lacedaemonians. Here, Amyntas, son of Andromenes, rejoined Alexander with the forces he had raised from Macedonia. Alexander integrated the horsemen into the companion cavalry and the foot soldiers into various infantry regiments, organizing them by nationality. He also established 2 companies in each cavalry squadron, a new innovation, and appointed companions of outstanding merit as their captains. Chapter 5: Conquests and Rebellions in Eastern Persia. Alexander departed Susa, crossed the Tigris River, and invaded Uxian territory. The Uxians living on the plains, who were subject to the Persian viceroy, surrendered to Alexander. However, the mountain Uxians, independent of Persia, informed Alexander they would only permit his passage into Persis if he paid them the same toll they received from the Persian king. Alexander sent the messengers back, instructing them to meet him at the mountain defiles they controlled, promising to pay the toll there. He then took his royal bodyguards, shield-bearing infantry, and 8,000 other soldiers. Guided by Sujans, he marched by night on an unfrequented, rough, and difficult road. That same day, he attacked Uxian villages, seizing much booty and killing many in their sleep, though others escaped to the mountains. He then made a forced march to the defile, where the Uxians planned to intercept him for the toll. Earlier, Alexander had dispatched Craterus to seize the heights where he believed the Uxians would retreat if repelled. Alexander himself, with great speed, secured the pass before their arrival. He deployed his men in battle formation and attacked the barbarians from the higher ground. Alarmed by Alexander's swiftness and outmaneuvered from their fortified position, the Uxians fled without a fight. Some were killed in flight, many perished falling from precipices, but most fled into the mountains, only to be destroyed by Craterus's men. After receiving these initial defeats, the Uxians, with much entreaty, including an appeal by Darius's mother on their behalf, secured Alexander's permission to retain their land in exchange for an annual tribute. The agreed tribute was 100 horses, 500 oxen, and 30,000 sheep, as the Uxians had no money and their land was unsuitable for farming. Most were shepherds and herdsmen. Following this, Alexander sent Parmenio with the baggage, Thessalian cavalry, Greek allies, mercenary auxiliaries, and heavier infantry to march into Persis via the main road. Alexander himself, with the Macedonian infantry, companion cavalry, light skirmishing cavalry, Agrianians, and archers, made a forced march through the mountains. Upon reaching the Persian gates, he found Ariobarzanes, viceroy of Persis, with 40,000 infantry and 700 cavalry, blocking the pass with a built wall and a nearby camp. Alexander established his own camp there. The next day, he led his army to the wall. Realizing its capture would be difficult due to the rugged terrain and suffering many casualties from enemy missiles launched from higher ground, he retreated to his camp. Prisoners informed him of an alternative route to outflank the pass. Ascertaining this route was rough and narrow, Alexander left Craterus at the camp with his own brigade, Meleager's brigade, a few archers, and 500 cavalry. Craterus was ordered to assault the wall once he saw Alexander approaching the Persian camp from the other side, signaled by trumpets. Alexander advanced by night, covering about 100 stades. He took the shield-bearing guards, Perdiccas's brigade, the lightest archers, Agrianians, the royal squadron of companion cavalry, and one additional cavalry regiment of 4 companies. Wheeling around with these troops, he marched towards the pass guided by the prisoners. He ordered Amintas, Philotas, and Cenas to lead the rest of the army towards the plain and build a bridge over the river leading into Persis. Alexander continued on the difficult, rough route, mostly at full speed. Before daylight, he surprised and destroyed the first barbarian guard and most of the second. The majority of the third guard escaped, not into Ariobarzanes' camp, but into the mountains, seized by sudden panic. Consequently, Alexander fell upon the enemy's camp at dawn, undetected. As he began assaulting the trench, trumpets signaled Craterus, who immediately attacked the advanced fortification. The enemy, confused by attacks from all sides, fled without engaging in close combat. They were trapped, with Alexander pressing from one direction and Craterus's men from another. Most were forced to flee into the fortifications, which the Macedonians had already secured. Alexander, anticipating this outcome, had left Ptolemy there with 3,000 infantry. Most barbarians were cut down in close quarters by the Macedonians. Others perished in the desperate flight, throwing themselves over precipices. Ariobarzanes himself, with a few horsemen, escaped into the mountains. Alexander swiftly returned to the river, found the bridge completed, and easily crossed with his army. He then continued his march to Persepolis, arriving before the city guards could plunder the treasury. He also captured the money at Pasargadae in the treasury of Cyrus the Great and appointed Phraseortes, son of Rheomithres, as viceroy over the Persians. He burned down the Persian palace, despite Parmenio's advice to preserve it, arguing that destroying his own property was unwise and would discourage Asians from joining him, suggesting he only intended to conquer, not rule, Asia. Alexander stated he wished to retaliate against the Persians for their invasion of Greece, their razing of Athens and burning of temples, and for all other injuries inflicted upon the Greeks. However, I believe Alexander did not act prudently on this occasion, nor do I see this as a fitting retribution for the ancient Persians. After these successful endeavors, Alexander advanced towards Media, having learned Darius was there. Darius had decided to remain among the Medes if Alexander stayed at Susa or Babylon, hoping for a change in Alexander's strategy. But if Alexander marched against him, Darius resolved to retreat into Parthia, Hyrcania, and as far as Bactria, laying waste to the land to hinder Alexander's advance. He therefore sent his women, remaining property, and covered carriages to the Caspian gates, while he stayed at Ecbatana with his immediate forces. Hearing this, Alexander advanced into Media, conquering and subduing the land of the Periateci. He appointed Oxythres, son of Abulites, the former viceroy of Susa, as its new viceroy. During the march, he was informed that Darius intended to meet him in battle, having acquired Scythian and Cadusian allies. Alexander ordered the baggage animals, their guards, and the rest of the baggage to follow while he led the rest of his army in battle formation. On the 12th day, he arrived in Media. There, he learned that Darius's forces were unfit for battle, his Cadusian and Scythian allies had not arrived, and he had resolved to flee. Alexander increased his speed. 3 days from Ecbatana, he met Bistanes, son of Achuz, who reigned over the Persians before Darius. Bistanes reported that Darius had fled 5 days prior, taking 7,000 talents of money from the Medes, along with an army of 3,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry. When Alexander reached Ecbatana, he sent the Thessalian cavalry and other Greek allies back to the sea, paying them their full stipulated hire and adding a donation of 2,000 talents from himself. He issued an order that any man who wished to continue serving for hire could re-enlist, and many did. He then ordered Epicillus, son of Polyides, to escort the others to the sea, using other cavalry as a guard, as the Thessalians were selling their horses there. He also instructed Menes to arrange triremes to transport them to Euboea upon their arrival at the sea. Alexander instructed Parmenio to deposit the money from Persis in the citadel at Ecbatana and entrust it to Harpalus. Harpalus had been left in charge of this money, guarded by 6,000 Macedonians, a few horsemen, and light-armed infantry. Parmenio himself was ordered to take the Greek mercenaries, Thracians, and all other cavalry, except the companion cavalry, and march through the land of the Cadusians into Hyrcania. Alexander also sent word to Clitus, commander of the royal cavalry squadron, who had been left ill at Susa, that upon reaching Ecbatana, he should take the Macedonians guarding the money there and proceed towards Parthia, where Alexander himself intended to arrive soon. Then, taking the companion cavalry, the light skirmishing cavalry, the Greek mercenary cavalry under Arigius, the Macedonian phalanx, excluding those guarding the money, the archers, and the Agrianians, Alexander marched against Darius. During this forced march, many soldiers, exhausted, fell behind, and many horses died. Despite this, he pressed on, arriving at Ragi on the 11th day. Ragi was a day's march from the Caspian gates at Alexander's pace. Darius had already passed through this defile before Alexander arrived, though many of his companions in flight had deserted him along the way and returned home. Many also surrendered to Alexander. Alexander now abandoned hope of capturing Darius through close pursuit and remained there for 5 days to rest his troops. He appointed Oxidates, a Persian who had been unjustly arrested by Darius and imprisoned at Susa, as viceroy of Media, a gesture designed to secure his loyalty. He then marched towards Parthia. On the first day he encamped near the Caspian gates, passing through them on the second day as far as the inhabited country extended. Hearing that the land further on was desert, he decided to procure provisions from his current camp and sent Zenith on a foraging expedition with the cavalry and a small body of infantry. Chapter 6. The Fate of Darius and Further Eastern Campaigns. At this critical juncture, Bagistanes, a Babylonian noble, arrived from Darius's camp with Antibalus, one of Mazias's sons. They reported that Anabasis, commander of Darius's fleeing cavalry, Bessus, viceroy of Bactria, and Barsanes, viceroy of Aricosha and Drangiana, had jointly arrested the king. Hearing this, Alexander accelerated his march even further, taking only the companions, skirmishing cavalry, and a selection of his strongest and lightest foot soldiers. He did not even wait for Zenith to return from foraging, instead placing Craterus in charge of the remaining troops with orders to follow in short marches. Alexander's men carried only their weapons and 2 days' provisions. After marching through the night and until noon the next day, Alexander granted a brief rest, then continued all night. At daybreak, he reached the camp from which Bagistanes had departed, but the enemy had gone. Regarding Darius, Alexander learned that he had been arrested and was being transported in a covered carriage. Bessus had assumed command instead of Darius and was named leader by the Bactrian cavalry and all other barbarians fleeing with Darius, except for Artabazus and his sons and the Greek mercenaries who remained loyal to Darius. However, unable to prevent the arrest, they had diverted their march from the main road, heading towards the mountains alone, refusing to participate in Bessus's enterprise. Alexander also learned that those who arrested Darius intended to surrender him to Alexander for personal gain if Alexander pursued them. If Alexander retreated, they planned to gather a large army and maintain control. For now, Bessus held supreme command due to his relation to Darius and because the war was in his viceregal province. Hearing this, Alexander deemed immediate, full-force pursuit essential. Despite his men and horses being exhausted from relentless exertion, he pressed on. After traveling through the entire night, and until noon the next day, he reached a village where Darius's captors had camped the day before. Learning the barbarians planned to continue their march that night, Alexander asked the locals for a shorter route. They indicated a waterless desert path. Nevertheless, he ordered them to guide him. Realizing his infantry could not keep up at full speed, he ordered 500 cavalrymen to dismount. Selecting infantry officers and the best foot soldiers, he had them mount the horses fully armed. He also directed Nicanor, commander of the shield-bearing guards, and Attalus, commander of the Agrianians, to lead their remaining men, lightly equipped, along Bessus's route, with the rest of the infantry following in regular marching order. Alexander himself began marching rapidly in the afternoon. After covering 400 stades overnight, he caught up with the barbarians just before daybreak. They were disorganized and unarmed. Few resisted. Most fled upon seeing Alexander himself, without engaging in combat. A few who turned to fight were killed, and the rest also fled. Until this point, Bessus and his followers were still transporting Darius in a covered carriage. But as Alexander closed in, Anabasis and Barsanes wounded Darius, left him, and fled with 600 horsemen. Darius died from his wounds shortly after, before Alexander could see him. Alexander sent Darius's body to Persis, ordering a royal burial in the manner of previous Persian kings. He then appointed Anabasis, a Parthian who had surrendered Egypt to Alexander with Mazax, as viceroy over the Parthians and Hyrcanians. He also appointed Lipolemus, son of Pythophanes, one of the companions, to guard his interests in Parthia and Hyrcania. Thus ended Darius, in the archonship of Aristophon in Athens, in the month of Hecatombaean. Darius was a king preeminently effeminate and lacking self-reliance in military affairs, though he never exhibited arbitrary conduct in civil matters, nor was it in his power to do so. He inherited the throne at the onset of war with Macedonians and Greeks, making tyranny over his subjects impossible, even if he desired it, as he faced greater danger than they. Throughout his reign, one misfortune accumulated upon another, with no respite from calamity from the moment he ascended. Early in his reign, his viceroys suffered a cavalry defeat at Granicus, and immediately Ionia, Elis, both Phrygias, Lydia, and all Curia except Halicarnassus were seized by his enemy. Soon after, Halicarnassus and the entire coast to Cilicia also fell. Then came his own defeat at Issus, where his mother, wife, and children were captured. Phoenicia and all of Egypt were lost. At Arbela, he himself fled disgracefully among the first, losing a vast army drawn from all nations of his empire. After this, wandering as an exile from his own dominions, he died betrayed by his personal attendants, subjected to the worst treatment possible, simultaneously king and a prisoner ignominiously led in chains. He ultimately perished through a conspiracy by his closest associates. Such were Darius's misfortunes in life. After his death, however, he received a royal burial. His children were given a princely upbringing and education by Alexander, as if their father were still king, and Alexander himself became his son-in-law. Darius was about 50 years old when he died. Alexander then rejoined the soldiers who had been left behind during his pursuit and advanced into Hyrcania, the country west of the road to Bactra. This region is bordered by dense, high mountains on one side and a plain stretching to the Great Sea on the other. He chose this route because he learned that the Greek mercenaries serving Darius had escaped through it into the Tepurian mountains. He also resolved to subdue the Tepurians themselves. Dividing his army into 3 parts, Alexander personally led the most numerous and lightest division along the shortest and most difficult route. He dispatched Craterus with his own brigade, Amyntas's brigade, some archers, and a few cavalry against the Tepurians. He ordered Arigius to take the Greek mercenaries and the rest of the cavalry, leading them along the longer public thoroughfare, overseeing the wagons, baggage, and camp followers. After crossing the first mountains and encamping, Alexander took the shield-bearing guards, the lightest men in the Macedonian phalanx, and some archers, proceeding along a difficult road. He placed guards at perilous points to prevent attacks from mountain barbarians on his following troops. After passing through the defile with his archers, he encamped on a plain near a small river. Here, Nabarzanes, Darius's cavalry commander, Phratophorns, viceroy of Hyrcania and Parthia, and other distinguished Persians who had attended Darius, arrived and surrendered. After waiting 4 days in camp, he reunited with those who had fallen behind on the march. All advanced safely, except for the Agrianians, who, while guarding the rear, were attacked by barbarian mountaineers. These barbarians quickly retreated after being defeated in the skirmish. From this place, Alexander advanced into Hyrcania as far as Zadrucarda, its capital. Here, Craterus rejoined him. Craterus had not encountered Darius's Greek mercenaries, but had thoroughly traversed the country, subduing some by force and gaining others through voluntary capitulation. Arigius also arrived with the baggage and wagons. Soon after, Artabazus came to Alexander with 3 of his sons, Cophen, Ariobarzanes, and Arzames, accompanied by Autophrodates, viceroy of Tapuria, and envoys from Darius's Greek mercenaries. Alexander restored Autophrodates to his viceregal office. Artabazus and his sons were kept honorably near Alexander, both for their loyalty to Darius and their noble Persian status. To the Greek envoys, who sought a truce for the entire mercenary force, Alexander replied he would make no agreement. He stated they were highly culpable for serving barbarians against Greece, violating Greek resolutions. He commanded them to surrender en masse, allowing him to treat them as he pleased, or to save themselves as best they could. The envoys agreed to surrender themselves and their comrades to Alexander, and urged him to send someone to lead them safely to him, stating they numbered 1,500. Accordingly, Alexander sent Andronicus, son of Agarus, and Artabazus to them. Alexander then marched against the Mardians, taking the shield-bearing guards, archers, Agrianians, Cenuses and Amyntas's brigades, half of the companion cavalry and the horse lancers. He now had a troop of horse lancers. Traversing most of Mardian territory, he killed many who fled, and some who resisted, and took many prisoners. For a long time, no one had invaded their land hostilely, not only due to its ruggedness, but also because the people were poor yet warlike. Therefore, they never feared Alexander would attack them, especially as he had already advanced beyond their country. For this reason, they were caught more easily off guard. Many, however, escaped into the mountains, which were very high and craggy, believing Alexander would not penetrate even there. But when he approached them even here, they sent envoys to surrender themselves and their land. He pardoned them and appointed Autophrodates, whom he had also recently placed over the Tepurians as their viceroy. Returning to the camp from which he had invaded Mardian territory, Alexander found that Darius's Greek mercenaries had arrived, accompanied by Lacedaemonian envoys to King Darius. These men were Callicratidas, Posippus, Monomus, Onomos, and Dropides from Athens. They were arrested and kept under guard. However, he released the envoys from Sinope, as these people were not part of the Greek commonwealth, and being subject to the Persians, their embassy to their own king seemed reasonable. He also released other Greeks who had served for pay with the Persians before the peace and alliance between Greeks and Macedonians. Likewise, he released Heraclides, the ambassador from the Chalcedonians to Darius. The remaining mercenaries he ordered to serve in his army for the same pay they received from the Persian king, placing them under the command of Andronicus, who had led them and had evidently taken prudent measures to save their lives. Chapter 7. Pursuit of Bessus and Purges in the army. Having concluded these matters, Alexander marched to Zadrukarta, Hyrcania's largest city and seat of government. After a 15-day stay, during which he offered customary sacrifices and held athletic contests, he began his march towards Parthia, and then to the borders of Arria, reaching Susia, a city in that province. There, Satabarzanes, the viceroy of Arria, met him. Alexander reinstated Satabarzanes and sent him with Anabasis, one of the companions, who was given 40 horse lancers to guard the area, preventing harm to the Arrians as the army passed through. At this time, some Persians reported that Bessus had adopted the upright tiara and Persian dress, calling himself Artaxerxes and claiming to be king of Asia. They added that he had with him the Persians who had escaped to Bactria, many Bactrians, and was expecting Scythian allies. With all his forces now assembled, Alexander proceeded towards Bactria. Philip, son of Menelaus, joined him from Media with the Greek mercenary cavalry under his command, the Thessalians who had volunteered to remain, and Andromachus's men. Nicanor, son of Parmenio, commander of the shield-bearing guards, had already died of disease. While en route to Bactria, Alexander received news that Satabarzanes, viceroy of Arria, had killed Anabasis and his horse lancers. Satabarzanes had armed the Arrians, gathered them in Artacoana, their capital, and planned to leave as soon as he knew Alexander had advanced, joining Bessus in an attack on the Macedonians when opportunity arose. Receiving this news, Alexander halted his march towards Bactria. Taking the companion cavalry, horse lancers, archers, Agrianians, and the regiments of Amintas and Caenis, he left the rest of his forces under Craterus's command and made a forced march against Satabarzanes and the Arrians. After traveling 600 stades in 2 days, he neared Artacoana. However, as soon as Satabarzanes perceived Alexander's proximity, he was terrified by the speed of his arrival and fled with a few Arrian horsemen, deserted by most of his soldiers who also learned of Alexander's presence. Alexander pursued rapidly, killing some of the rebels discovered fleeing their villages in various directions and selling others into slavery. He then appointed Arzames, a Persian, as viceroy over the Arrians. Rejoined by the troops left with Craterus, he marched into the land of the Zorangians, reaching their seat of government. Barcianes, who then controlled the land and was among those who attacked Darius in his flight, fled to the Indians west of the Indus upon Alexander's approach. However, they arrested and sent him back to Alexander, who executed him for his actions against Darius. It was here that Alexander uncovered the conspiracy of Philotas, son of Parmenio. Ptolemy and Aristobulus claim it had been reported to him earlier in Egypt, but he found it incredible due to their long-standing friendship, the public honor he accorded Parmenio, and his trust in Philotas. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, states that Philotas was brought before the Macedonians, where Alexander vehemently accused him. Philotas defended himself, but the plot's divulgers came forward, convicting him and his accomplices with clear evidence. Crucially, Philotas himself confessed to hearing of a conspiracy against Alexander, but said nothing to the king, despite visiting the royal tent twice daily. Philotas and all co-conspirators were killed by the Macedonians with javelins. Polydamas, one of the companions, was dispatched to Parmenio, carrying letters from Alexander to the generals in Media, Cleander, Cytalces, and Menidas, who commanded Parmenio's army. These men executed Parmenio. Alexander perhaps deemed it impossible for Philotas to conspire without his father's knowledge, or he feared Parmenio, even if innocent, would be dangerous after his son's violent death. Furthermore, Parmenio was highly respected by Alexander and the entire army, wielding great influence among both Macedonian and Greek auxiliary troops, whom he often commanded with Alexander's approval. They also say that around the same time, Amyntas, son of Andromenes, along with his brothers Polemo, Attalus, and Simmias, was tried for complicity in the conspiracy against Alexander, owing to their trust and close friendship with Philotas. Public suspicion was fueled by Polemo, one of Amyntas's brothers, fleeing to the enemy when Philotas was arrested. Amyntas and his other two brothers stayed to face trial. Amyntas defended himself so vigorously before the Macedonians that he was acquitted. Immediately after his acquittal, he requested permission to retrieve his brother. The Macedonians agreed, and he brought Polemo back the same day, clearing his name even further. However, shortly after, while besieging a village, Amyntas was struck by an arrow and died of the wound, gaining no benefit from his acquittal beyond dying with an unblemished reputation. Alexander appointed two commanders over the companion cavalry, Hephaestion, son of Amyntar, and Clytus, son of Dropidas, dividing the companion brigade into two parts. He did not want any single friend to command so many horsemen, especially as they were the best of his cavalry in public esteem and martial discipline. He then arrived in the land of the people formerly called Ariaspians, later named Euergeti, benefactors, because they assisted Cyrus, son of Cambyses, in his Scythian invasion. Alexander honored these people, whose ancestors had served Cyrus. Discovering they possessed a form of government unlike other barbarians in that region and claimed justice equal to the best Greeks, he set them free and granted them as much adjacent territory as they requested, which was not extensive. Here, he offered sacrifice to Apollo and arrested Demetrius, one of his confidential bodyguards, suspected of involvement with Philotas's conspiracy. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, was appointed to fill Demetrius's vacated post. Chapter 8. Crossing the Hindu-Koosh and conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana. After settling these matters, Alexander advanced against Bactria and Bessus, subduing the Drangians and Gedrosians on his march. He also conquered the Aracocians and appointed Menon as their viceroy. He then reached the Indians inhabiting the land bordering the Aracocians. He reached all these nations by marching through deep snow, his soldiers enduring provision scarcity and severe hardship. Learning that the Arrians had revolted again due to Satabarzanes invading their land with 2,000 cavalry received from Bessus, Alexander dispatched Artabazus the Persian with Arigius and Carinus, two of the companions, against them. He also ordered Phrataphernes, viceroy of the Parthians, to assist in attacking the Arrians. A fiercely contested battle ensued between Arigius and Carinus's troops and Satabarzanes' forces. The barbarians held their ground until Satabarzanes encountered Arigius and was killed by a spear thrust to the face. Then, the barbarians broke ranks and fled headlong. Meanwhile, Alexander led his army towards Mount Caucasus, Hindu-Koosh, where he founded a city and named it Alexandria. After offering customary sacrifices, he crossed Mount Caucasus. He appointed Proexes, a Persian, as viceroy over the land and left Niloxenus, son of Satyrus, one of the companions, with an army as superintendent. According to Aristobulus, Mount Caucasus is as lofty as any in Asia, mostly bare in the part Alexander crossed. This mountain range extends so far that Mount Taurus, which borders Cilicia and Pamphylia, is said to spring from it, as do other great ranges distinguished by various names. Aristobulus states that in this part of the Caucasus, nothing grew except terebinth trees and silphium, yet it supported many people and numerous sheep and oxen, as sheep are very fond of silphium. If a sheep smells it even from a distance, it runs to it and feeds on the flower. They also dig up and devour its root. For this reason, in Cyrene, some shepherds drive their flocks far from silphium fields, while others even fence off the areas to prevent sheep from entering. Silphium was very valuable to the Cyrenians. Bessus, accompanied by the Persians who had participated in Darius's seizure, and by 7,000 Bactrians and Dons from west of the Tanais, was laying waste to the country at the foot of Mount Caucasus. His aim was to prevent Alexander's further advance by creating desolation and a lack of provisions between them. Nevertheless, Alexander pressed on, though with difficulty due to deep snow and lack of supplies, persevering in his journey. When Bessus learned Alexander was near, he crossed the Oxus River, burned his boats, and retreated to Nautaka in Sogdiana. He was followed by Spitamines and Oxyarts with Sogdian cavalry, and the Dons from the Tanais. However, the Bactrian cavalry, seeing Bessus resolved to flee, dispersed in various directions to their homes. Alexander arrived at Drapsica, rested his army, then marched to Aornus and Bactra, the largest cities in Bactria. He took these at the first assault, leaving a garrison in Aornus citadel under Archelaus, son of Androcles, one of the companions. He appointed Artabazus the Persian as viceroy over the rest of the easily subdued Bactrians. He then marched towards the Oxus River, which flows from Mount Caucasus. It is the largest river in Asia that Alexander's army encountered, except for the Indian rivers, which are the largest in the world. The Oxus discharges into the Great Sea near Hyrcania. When he attempted to cross, the river appeared impassable. It was about 6 stades wide and disproportionately deep. Its sandy bed and rapid current easily uprooted deeply driven stakes, as they could not be secured in the sand. Additionally, timber was scarce, and transporting materials from afar for a bridge would cause significant delay. Therefore, Alexander ordered soldiers to fill their tent skins with dry chaff, tying and stitching them tightly to prevent water penetration. Once filled and sewn, these were sufficient to transport the army across in 5 days. Before crossing, he selected the oldest Macedonians unfit for military service, and those Thessalians who had volunteered to remain, and sent them home. He then dispatched Stacenor, one of the companions, to Arria, instructing him to arrest Arzames, the viceroy, whom he suspected of disaffection, and to assume the viceroyalty of Arria himself. After crossing the Oxus, Alexander made a forced march to where he heard Bessus was. At this time, messengers from Spitamines and Datafernes arrived, announcing they would arrest and hand over Bessus if Alexander sent a small army and a commander, as they were already guarding him, though unbound. Hearing this, Alexander rested his army and marched more slowly. He dispatched Ptolemy, son of Lagus, with 3 troops of companion cavalry, all the horse lancers, the infantry brigade of Philotas, 1 regiment of 1,000 shield-bearing guards, all the Agrianians, and half the archers, with orders to make a forced march to Spitamines and Datafernes. Ptolemy followed instructions, completing a 10-day march in 4 days, arriving at the camp where Spitamines' barbarians had bivouacked the previous day. Here, Ptolemy learned that Spitamines and Datafernes were wavering in their resolve to betray Bessus. He therefore left the infantry to follow in regular order and advanced with the cavalry. He reached a village where Bessus was with a few soldiers, as Spitamines and his party had already departed, ashamed to personally betray Bessus. Ptolemy surrounded the walled village, which had gates. He then proclaimed to the barbarians within that they would be unharmed if they surrendered Bessus. They admitted Ptolemy and his men. He seized Bessus and departed, sending a messenger to ask Alexander how to present the prisoner. Alexander ordered him to bind Bessus naked in a wooden collar and place him on the right side of the road where the army would march. Ptolemy did so. When Alexander saw Bessus, he stopped his chariot and asked why Bessus had first arrested Darius, his own king, kinsman, and benefactor, then led him in chains as a prisoner, and finally killed him. Bessus claimed it was not his sole decision, but a joint act of those present with Darius, aimed at securing their own safety from Alexander. For this, Alexander ordered Bessus to be scourged, and the herald to repeat Alexander's reproaches during the interrogation. After this disgraceful torture, he was sent to Bactria for execution. Such is Ptolemy's account of Bessus. Aristobulus, however, says Spitamenes and Datafernes brought Bessus to Ptolemy, bound him naked in a wooden collar, and handed him over to Alexander. Alexander supplied his cavalry with horses from the district, as many of his own had perished crossing the Caucasus and during the marches to and from the Oxus. He then led his army to Maracanda, the capital of Sogdiana. From there, he advanced to the Tanais River. Aristobulus states that the neighboring barbarians call this river the Jaxartes. Like the Oxus, it originates in Mount Caucasus and also empties into the Hyrcanian Sea. This must be a different Tanais from that mentioned by Herodotus, who describes it as the 8th Scythian river, flowing from a great lake and discharging into a larger lake called Maeotis. Some designate Herodotus's Tanais as the boundary of Europe and Asia, saying that the Palus Maeotis, issuing from the furthest recess of the Euxine Sea, and this Tanais, discharging into the Maeotis, separate Asia and Europe, just as the sea near Gadira and the nomad Libyans opposite Gadira separate Libya and Europe. Libya is also said by these men to be divided from the rest of Asia by the Nile River. At the Tanais River, some Macedonians on a foraging mission were cut down by barbarians. The perpetrators escaped to a mountain, rugged and precipitous on all sides, numbering about 30,000. Alexander took the lightest men in his army and marched against them. The Macedonians made many ineffectual assaults on the mountain. Initially, they were repelled by barbarian missiles, and many were wounded, including Alexander himself, who was shot through the leg with an arrow, breaking his fibula. Despite this, he captured the place. Some barbarians were cut down by the Macedonians, while many cast themselves from the rocks and perished, so that out of 30,000, no more than 8,000 survived.